Hello and welcome to After Havo. I wanted to do a milestones video on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it's now been almost, I think, 2 or 3 months since I read them, and my memory is not going to be nearly as good as when I read them initially, but gosh, it's such a video that I've wanted to make for such a long time. Ever since I read these two books, I've just been thinking about them so much, because you know when you read something and as you're reading it, you realize just how influential it is, and you can actually kind of read the future books that were influenced by it as you go through the text. I felt that while reading The Lord of the Rings, I felt that while reading Catcher in the Rye, I felt that while reading a lot of classic literature text, that whilst I didn't enjoy those texts themselves, it really helped inform my understanding of just how much got influenced by it, just how much they changed the way that we look at literature and we look at writing and storytelling. So I had not felt that as strongly for any other text than I did for the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I'm titling this video Reading the Iliad and the Odyssey to Understand Ulysses. And yeah, I'll talk about that a bit, but really, I find that I understand a lot of literature in general better for having read these two books, for how similar they are sometimes to the way that we look at storytelling today, but also how different they are, how they divert from what I would normally expect from regular storytelling, being that they are so old, and then realizing how the bits that are similar are things that have been taken by future authors and transformed and reworked, but are still kind of constant in the way that we look at these two texts. So I, to be honest, don't know very much about them. I did my cursory research before, during, after reading it, but ultimately I'm not a scholar and I can't say authoritatively anything about these books. Really what I'm doing here is just reflecting on my experience reading this for the first time as someone who likes fiction but otherwise doesn't really know anything about this. And it was fun, it was interesting. I'm not giving a rating, I'm not making the same mistake as last time. I didn't love the experience, and there are certainly things that would be a barrier for most people to enjoy this. But overall, I was really enlightened by it, and I would do it again. It's a great set of stories that's just really interesting to me. So for some brief historical context, this is not, again, an instructional video. This is just me reflecting on what I think I knew reading these books. The Iliad and the Odyssey cover the Trojan War, which is a period of mythological significance in Greek mythology, where the Greek army went to Troy to basically destroy it, blow it up. There's a whole convoluted story about Paris being given an apple of chaos from Eris that just said, "to the most beautiful," and then all the women of the Greek pantheon, well, the three women of the Greek pantheon who were enticed by this then went down to Paris and tried to convince him why he should give the apple to them. Eventually this resulted in Paris being given Helen as to be his bride, the most beautiful woman in the world at the time, who then was married to Menelaus, who was Greek. And because of this, Menelaus got really angry, called up all his Greek friends, and then rode down on his ship to go and destroy Troy. I'm massively simplifying this, and if you want to get a sense of the narrative of the Trojan War, the Iliad is not really where you go for that. I think there's a lot of better retellings and just better works that generally summarize what's happening in this period of mythology, because the Iliad only covers a little bit of it, and it kind of assumes you already know what happens in that story. It's not a book that is trying to tell you something. Instead, it's really trying to get you to feel what it might have been like to be there, to be a soldier in that battlefield, to be really affected by the ups and downs of battle, to see your side of the army either winning or losing, and the reasons for that. And so come into this story with a general understanding of who the Greek pantheon is and what happens in the Trojan War, and it then becomes a much more interesting experience. So from, again, what I understand of the way the story is told in Greek storytelling is that there is a sequence of epic poems called the something. It's called the Epic Cycle. And the Epic Cycle is a mostly lost sequence of ancient Greek poems that were written around 700 BC or so, And we know they exist because of a lot of different historical sources, but nearly all of them have been completely lost. Some of them we have only fragments of, and the Iliad and the Odyssey, depending on which scholar you ask, either fits within that cycle or sits apart from that cycle. And there's a lot of debate around that, around what the cycle really was, what the intention of that cycle was, where the Iliad and the Odyssey fall within that. The main thing to note is that the Iliad and the Odyssey are kind of self-enclosed narratives, but they're also describing aspects of a much larger narrative. The Iliad begins midway through the Trojan War, so we skip over all that begins the conflict, and we arrive at really the beachhead that the Greeks set up outside the Trojan walls. And we follow the beginning where Achilles is really pissed off at Agamemnon, who's the leader of the Greek army. Achilles is really pissed off because, again, something that kind of happens in backstory. There is a servant woman named Briseia, and the kind of loyalty of her is in question. And so because of that, Achilles tells his entire force, the Myrmidons, who are feared and known for being very powerful, he tells them all, okay, we're not going to fight. We're going to just sit here and chill and just watch the Greeks lose. And everybody there can know that it's Agamemnon's fault for this happening. And I kind of love that. Like, I kind of love the utter pettiness of a man who is blessed by the gods to be incredibly powerful, basically invulnerable, and his crack team of super powerful soldiers just sitting there going, you're losing, and we know why. Sucks to be you guys. Like, that's so funny to me. And so because of that, there's the push and pull of the war. Nearly the entirety of the Iliad is just this conflict, where we have all the named soldiers of the war going up against each other, killing each other, very, very detailed descriptions of fighting and combat, and every now and then one of the soldiers will just go full beast mode and become invulnerable and kill like 100 people. And in those moments we see people ascend to glory effectively. They enshrine their names through the acts of battle that they do. And as they do this, the other side kind of, when people die, they get a brief moment of remembrance as well. So when someone dies, Homer likes to elaborate a little bit on who they were, who their family was, how they died, and what kind of legacy they leave, sometimes in the span of just one or two lines. But the level of detail and care that goes into naming these individual soldiers, talking about their background, and connecting them to this wider network, all of that effort is completely bizarre to me. Like, it doesn't make sense in a storytelling sense, because as the character dies, we learn so much about them, and then they stop being a narrative force. So it is different. It makes me feel differently than when I read fiction and when I read a story that's designed to use plot and character setting to create emotions for me. Rather, it creates emotions for me almost like I'm reading nonfiction, or almost like I'm reading a particularly detailed news article in some senses. The emotion doesn't come from the plot. It comes from the fact that now I realize that every person in this big conflict is a named person, is a human being. That war is so terrible that it steals away men in their youth and erases everything that they've been able to go through, their family, their loved ones, their everything, and crushes it down into this tiny moment of life and death, and they're gone, and that's it, and death is final, and that's just the consequence of war. But on the flip side of it, there's that, I want to say in this text, very masculine urge to prove oneself, to make oneself glorious, and that's done through the fighting as well, and through the testing of oneself and one's army against another force, despite the fact that it's about ostensibly one of the largest wars to have happened at that period of history in cultural knowledge. it's really fixated on the individual human beings that fight the battle. It really doesn't boil down people into factions or treat deaths as a statistic. It instead will just spend a lot of time talking about every single individual person that has some role to play. It talks about what brought them to the fight, what motivates them to fight, the intricacies of how they fight, what weapons they use, what their armor is like, how they decorate themselves, how they speak to their enemies. You start to learn people based on the ones who survive and you see for a long time. Like, you know very familiarly Aeneas and Pallas and Hector and Ajax and all the characters. You get really familiar with them and you spend a lot of time with them, and it's a long poem. Word-wise, most translations sit around the 100 to 120,000 word length, so the length of above average length novel. And it's really just people killing each other, because the book, I could be wrong, I haven't read this in a while, it doesn't show you the end of the war. It doesn't show you the end of the war. It ends before that. It ends, I want to say it ends with the death of Hector. I think it ends with the death of Hector, which is just part of this pull and push back and forth, where Hector ends up killing Patroclus, who is a very close person to Achilles. Patroclus had put on Achilles' armor to try and win some glory for the Greeks, and Achilles is distraught, goes and kills Hector and desecrates his body, and it kind of exacerbates the war from there. Everybody starts doing worse and more powerful things to each other. So in terms of just narrative structure, the Iliad is quite stagnant. It doesn't have a journey, so to speak. It doesn't have one character becoming anything else, or learning anything else, or doing anything else. Instead, it's very blow by blow, and it's very textured. It is certainly incredibly emotional. There are some very powerful speeches in here that do make you feel something for these characters, and that feeling is strengthened by the fact that a lot of it is actually quite futile, because one character's moment of glory will be cut short, and another character will step in their place and they will have the moment of glory, and they too will be cut short. They don't get to have that kind of narrative significance. And again, because of the war, because of the way the war is structured. It's tragic. It really got to me. I had a really emotional time reading this book, seeing characters that I got really familiar with killed off, and then other people rise up and take their place, and that's kind of it. It did things to me that I don't know if any other work has really done. It's just made me think of human beings and identity and relationships and conflict in quite a different way. So that's the Iliad. That's the Iliad. I don't have a copy of the Odyssey, so I read the Odyssey via an ebook. I didn't bring a copy with me. And actually, this copy isn't the one that I read for the Iliad, but more on that later. The Odyssey is very, very different. So there are some poems that tell the story of what happened in between the Iliad and the Odyssey, including the very famous Trojan horse story where Odysseus sneaks the Greek army into the Trojan walls and ends the war. That's skipped over. And so the Odyssey starts with... Okay, the Odyssey, I'm going to get so many things wrong here. And there's going to be ancient Greek scholars and academics and people who are just going to facepalm at how basic everything is. The Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus' journey back to Ithaca to try and reclaim his position as the king there, where a bunch of suitors have lined up for the hand of his bride in marriage because they don't think that Odysseus is going to get back there anymore. In the meantime, the journey that Odysseus takes is not a straightforward one. It's really meandering. He gets distracted a lot of times, and there's a lot of divine intervention and meddling to try and stop him from getting to where he wants to go. That's the story of the Odyssey, but it begins with Telemachus, who is Odysseus' son. And Telemachus never gives up hope that his father is coming home. And so he decides to, in this really dangerous situation in Ithaca, where anybody could snatch the hand of Penelope if she would just so allow it, and thus become the king of Ithaca, and making Telemachus in an extremely dangerous position because he's now the son of the previous king. Telemachus decided to sneak past all the suitors and go out searching for his father himself. And so when Telemachus does this, he goes on his own little journey of actualization as someone who will eventually be the heir of Ithaca, but also as someone who's inherited a lot of the qualities of Odysseus. So Odysseus is known for being very cunning, very strategic, both in terms of military might, but also in terms of his interpersonal relations. He is able to motivate people and get people on his side and quell conflicts, and that was something that was very instrumental across the Iliad. Whereas a lot of characters in the Iliad were motivated by passion and emotion, and those are all really great things. Odysseus was someone who could moderate that and could talk to the other characters and explain to them, maybe now's not the time to do that. So we have this journey, and we have Odysseus' journey kind of summarized for us, because we don't get to sit there with him as he does all these things. Instead, we look back on it because of the weird non-linear structure that this poem takes. The first half of it, Odysseus is briefly summarizing the various trials he undergoes, very famous ones like killing the Cyclops and saving his men, and then eventually losing all his men to Circe, the witch, and other various things. Going to the River of the Dead, blah, 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 blah. Incredibly archetypal symbols that have wound their way all through history. So that's all well and good and cool. And then the second half is Odysseus arriving back at Ithaca and trying to find a way to get back into the castle and to reclaim his throne at the right moment without getting horribly murdered. Because the suitors are there, and the suitors are just waiting patiently outside Penelope's door. And so if Odysseus was just to rock up and go, "Hey guys, I'm home," he'll just get killed. So Telemachus eventually finds Odysseus, and then they scheme up this plan for Odysseus to get back into the castle in a safe and reasonable way. And then the end of the Odyssey is a kind of like an emotional explosion, because Odysseus takes his place on the throne and kills all of the suitors, and just upends all of Ithaca by just how tremendous this return is. That it's this carnival. I don't know why I want to use the word carnival, but it really is. It's this high energy, chaotic moment of violence and retribution that's been stewing for all of this poem, that things are not the way they should be, and there is a very violent writing of that towards the end. So some readers might think of this as very cathartic, and the way that the suitors are presented too is that on one hand they're pragmatic, on the other hand they're terrible. They're not good people. You can kind of understand why they're in the role they are, why they're so desperate for Penelope's hand in marriage, but on the other hand, you recognize the threat that they pose to Telemachus and Odysseus, and we do grow to like Telemachus and Odysseus throughout the course of the Odyssey, so we don't feel that bad when the suitors get killed. Like, I'm a person who tends to feel bad when anybody gets killed in a novel. I mean, I've talked about the Iliad, right? I felt bad about everybody, but the suitors, not so much. Yeah, it is what it is. So that's the Iliad and Odyssey. That's the plot spoiled for them. Isn't that weird though? Because I went into these two books thinking that they would tell very straightforward stories. The Iliad would be a historical summary of the Trojan War from the apple to the horse, and I thought the Odyssey would be a very straightforward journey narrative, ending with Odysseus arriving at Ithaca, and I did not get that. I absolutely did not get that. I did get a bunch of really archetypal moments and symbols and characters that I start to recognize in future novels, and I will go on to talk about Ulysses a bit, but I do think that the kind of journey narrative of Odysseus is everywhere. It's such a salient narrative, and it's something that it gets me going every time. Like, no matter how many times I see the story of someone trying to travel to a far off land and meeting people and dodging trials and arriving back in this explosion of emotion, whether it's violence in this case, or whether it's of joy or relief or desire or longing or anything, that narrative is powerful for me. And every time I read it in a new fashion, it's still powerful to me. It doesn't get old, it doesn't get boring. And the way that it's told, I think, subconsciously has a lot to owe from this original ancient poem. Whether you believe that across all cultures and across all humans there's this hard-coded narrative to journey and to come back home, or whether it is actually a more direct literary lineage that the authors who were influenced by Homer then went on to influence others, and this giant publishing monster that we have today just works its way into every book that comes out. Regardless of that, just the DNA of these two texts is present a lot in just about everything that you can read. So going back to read these original poems, I had, as a person who enjoys narrative, a really fantastic, or at least a really fascinating time. I had a lot to think about. Okay, so now that I've mainly spoiled these two ancient poems, I do want to talk a bit about the practicalities of reading this. So the Iliad and the Odyssey both have plenty of translations, and it's hard to tell which one you're getting or what reputation the one that you get has until you start reading it. So I don't have a whole lot of experience reading classical texts as like ancient Greek, ancient Latin texts. I have a very small amount from high school Latin. I did read a very small amount of the Aeneid in the original Latin with the rest of my Latin class. And I would hope that experience gives me a little bit more insight into the Odyssey and the Iliad. But there is this kind of delightfulness of being able to read the original language and understanding how the way the grammar works. And I was also quite humbled to think about how old the Iliad is and how difficult it is for someone to read and translate it. Because if I think about time, and I think about the Old Testament as one of the most common works of ancient Greek that people read when they learn ancient Greek, the Iliad is 700 years older than that. And if I think about time in today's terms, if I was to read a book today and then read a book from the 1300s, 700 years ago from today, I would not be able to read. It would not be the same English. Language, I'm sure, evolves at different rates at different times, but it's very understandable that Homeric Greek is completely different from New Testament era ancient Greek. And in the same way that Middle English is completely different to English that we read today, we can kind of grasp at it, but it's a different skill set. So over time, there have been translators who have tackled the Iliad and the Odyssey in various ways. There's lots of arguments about which way is better. There is a method that tries to preserve the literal meaning of the words, a method that tries to preserve the poetic qualities of the original text. Whether or not it's even rendered in verse is a big deal. Whether or not it has other poetic techniques, whether or not it rhymes is a big deal. Whether it scans is a big deal. There's so many things to debate. The main things to think about when picking a translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey is that there is a wider category of older translations. So translations done in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s, at a time when interest in ancient Greek literature was very high, and a lot of people who wanted to prove their intelligence would just translate this book for fun. Sometimes you recognize those names, like Robert Graves did a translation of the Iliad. I don't know why, but he did it. But it can be very fun, right? A lot of these translations tend to be in the public domain, and so if you buy the cheapest edition, like this one I have here of the Iliad, which I purchased for, what is that, $6.99? And I think I got it, buy one, get one free. It's probably going to be one of these older editions, and this one is the translation by George Chapman. Very unhelpfully, it doesn't say when the translation by George Chapman was done. But George Chapman was born in 1559. And the common consensus with this version of the Iliad is that it translates the ancient Greek into Shakespearean English. But very intricate and beautiful Shakespearean English, and if you like reading Shakespeare, you will get a lot out of reading this translation that you will get from reading Shakespeare. But for most people that are trying to understand the Iliad, this is not the way to go. This is not going to make any sense to you. And you're not going to feel what you ideally should feel when you read the Iliad. So there is a debate over which of the modern translations is better. There are lots of great options available. I happened to read the Robert Fakel's one, and I enjoyed it. I think I never really hit a point reading the Robert Fakel's translation of either the Iliad or the Odyssey where I was reminded that I'm not reading an ancient text, and that I had trouble understanding the emotional intent of the verses. And it did still have some of the poetic quality, but it didn't have a lot of it. Like, it didn't feel like the author was trying to be especially poetic, but I did understand that it was meant to be poetry. I didn't read any of John Latimer's version. I also didn't read any of the other modern versions that I've heard a lot about. If I do end up with a greater interest in classical literature, maybe I will go back and read a few more of the translations. But I do recommend a modern version, whichever the modern versions. From what I can see, just about all of them are fine. Like, there isn't no real commercial modern version of the Iliad where everyone's like, do not touch this one, I think. Just pick one and go. But do be wary that the ancient ones are more of an acquired taste, and I do see a lot of people recommending not to read any of the ancient, or not the ancient, but like the older ones, the classical, I don't know what to say, the 16, 17, 1800s ones. I see people saying not to read those until you've read a modern one, and until you actually get what this is trying to do. So there's required reading for required reading for required reading. Read some knowledge about the Trojan War and about the Greek pantheon, then read the modern translation, and then read the ancient translation. And then if you're cool, learn ancient Greek, and then read them in the original language. Okay, so this video has gone well on long enough. The last thing I did want to mention was, is this book useful for reading Ulysses? Or, not the Iliad, but is the Odyssey useful for reading Ulysses? I'm about 200 pages into Ulysses so far, so maybe this will change over time, but I'm starting to understand how the Odyssey factors into Ulysses, and it's not a lot. I think, again, I could be totally wrong. I will, when I finish Ulysses, come back to this and maybe be eating my words. But from what I understand, James Joyce used the Odyssey as a kind of structural framework while writing Ulysses, but he didn't want the book to be inaccessible to audiences who hadn't read the Odyssey. So in that sense, I don't notice that many connections. Like, I notice a few. I notice a few moments where details of the Odyssey show up in Ulysses, and I kind of see that overarching structure as well. It's been interesting looking at the structure of the indices for Ulysses, and seeing how each chapter is supposed to map to a chapter of the Odyssey, and thinking a little bit about that. But I've read the Odyssey once. I don't know it so well that I know what each individual chapter is about, and I'm not reading Ulysses to try and map those things. I think it might be very interesting for someone who is familiar with both texts to do that challenge and to actually see all the connections that exist there. I'm sure James Joyce would have loved to bury those connections for readers to find, but ultimately it's not necessary. What I am finding about Ulysses is that it's a lot more everyday than I thought, and it's a lot less heavy-handed than I would have thought. I think for a book that has a reputation of being a difficult work of literature, I would have thought that thematically it's challenging. But really, it's more everyday than I thought, and the dialogue is more vernacular than I thought. It's telling more jokes than I thought. And there are moments where I can think to myself, I think I do understand it, because all this needed me to do here is just chuckle. I didn't feel like I needed to get something. I don't feel like I'm reading a new language. Instead, I'm just kind of being transported, which is what I want to happen when I read. And I'm really glad that I get to read Ulysses and have that, and not have to worry about, I don't know what this reference means, or I don't get this connection to Ulysses or the Odyssey. It's just fine. And yeah, I'm having a good time. There is still heaps left, and I have paused it a little bit because I am not reading it very quickly, and I'm not getting through it. So we'll get back to it, and we'll see how it goes. But this has been interesting. I'm actually really thankful that I tried, and I'm really thankful that I read the Iliad and the Odyssey, trying to get to understand it. I just feel like I know more, and I feel like I respect stories more, and I understand stories more. And I'm also now a lot more keen to go out of my way and read non-Western epics as well. So as a Chinese man, I really do need to go back and read the full great works of Chinese literature. I have them on my shelf in the original Chinese. My Chinese is nowhere near good enough to understand them. But I would like to read them in English. I would like to know what their style of narrative is, and I would like to perhaps understand Chinese literature better and to make a better point about archetypal human narratives by looking at different cultures. We're just not there yet, and this is the third year of me making these silly videos, and we'll see. Maybe in 20 years, when I'm much older, I'll be able to make those videos, but right now I'm just some jerk on the internet who is reading ancient Greek works, and that has been fun, and thank you for watching and listening, and yes, all of that.